been talking about the narratives against The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder since they came out, right? I've talked about this. I've posted about like the weird arbitrary complaints. Back in the day, back in the Breath of the Wild days, it was like complaining about my weapon degradation system, right? It was about like complaining about the weapons breaking. And now it's this weird shift where we're like trying to gaslight people into thinking the game is a rehash and that nobody is talking about it. Again, that was the big cope throughout like all of 2023. Nobody is talking about it. Even though that's clearly a contradictory statement, even though that was observably not true, even though people were playing through the game, even though I released several statements talking about like how much I was enjoying the game and things along that line, like people really allowed this to be accepted as mainstream discourse in regard to both The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder. And if anything, I would argue it kind of like extends to other games in general because like you heard a lot of people say the same thing about Splatoon 3 and Luigi's Mansion 2 and Fire Emblem Engage, right? Emio, the Smiling Man. Like, it just seems to be the go-to cope right now. To downplay whatever Nintendo game comes out is just to, like, try and say, delusionally, that it's some big disaster, that nobody's talking about it, that nobody cares about it. Like, it's typical, like, Snoy nonsense, okay? Like, this is the kind of thing you used to see back in the Wii U days. And I do think that's, like, the issue that ever since like Animal Crossing New Horizons came out, which I think is shaping up to be like the most successful game in the Switch's lineup of successful games. Ever since New Horizons came out, there was now this new gold standard. So like Pretendos were able to gaslight people into thinking the console was trending downward when really it was just coming down from its all-time high. Like and that's all that needs to be said about this is that because the line stopped going up, that now means the Switch is a failure after becoming the most popular console of all time. Easily outstripping the PS2 and the PS1. Like the Nintendo Switch is this masterclass of a console, but people don't like admitting it. And so we're in this really weird situation now where every single Nintendo game has to be massively downplayed. No More Heroes 3 got attacked. Bayonetta 3 got attacked. Pokemon Legends Arceus, Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. Like the list really, 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 really keeps going on and on and on. Xenoblade Chronicles 3. How many times have you seen like some weird like Coomer on like 4chan trying to gaslight you into thinking that like Monolith Soft censored Xenoblade Chronicles 3? Like that's such a weird, nonsensical complaint about a game like this, but you have seriously like trying to make that argument. And it's gotten to the point where Xenoblade fans have gotten a reputation for like calling out these people on their nonsense. And so like now they have a reputation for being like these huge bootlickers because they seem to be one of the only groups in the Nintendo fan base that's willing to go up against like the autism of the Snoys, right? Everyone else, like this is my big criticism of Nintendo fans. Why are more people not standing up in support of Nintendo games? Like every single time, like it's this thing where like someone releases a statement about a game and it's like, oh, that's kind of true. Like, oh, I can see where you're coming from with that. Like people are way too nice about this. Like again, you need to tell these people to fuck off. Again, like I remember growing up and hearing people like talk shit like, oh, Ocarina of Time is just a remake of A Link to the Past. Nobody who seriously played both would think that. It's so completely like out of touch with reality and really has nothing to do with anything other than like some vague similarities because, they're part of the same IP or whatever, right? They're nothing alike, like outside of the general core structure and gameplay. And yet, for some reason, that was like taken as gospel from a lot of people, right? Like, again, even today, you still see a handful of people insisting only the first 5 Zeldas was good. Now, obviously, that is a complete cope and completely out of touch with reality, right? it it's just not true at all. But a lot of people religiously swear by that. You see that with the Super Mario Bros. Games, where people say the game stopped being good after 3, or World, right? Everyone disavows New Super Mario Bros. Everyone disavows like Mario Wonder, right? You see this with like 3D Mario sometimes, where people attack everything after Galaxy, right? Galaxy is my favorite game ever. Like everything after that was a disappointment, right? You see this with like Metroid games sometimes. I grew up being told that Metroid Fusion was so bad that I shouldn't even be like, again. It took me over a decade, to get around to playing Metroid Fusion, because I was told by everyone that the game was terrible, that it was a step down from Super, that I shouldn't bother playing it. And when I finally got around to playing it, I realized it was actually a really good game. And I can see that like the same thing is happening with like Samus Returns and Metroid Dread. Fantastic new Metroid games that should have gotten way more praise and attention were just relegated to just being attacked for no reason. Kid Icarus Uprising, right? This big revival of a classic gaming IP. Game journos, most notably people like Jim Sterling, a man who has a vendetta against Nintendo. Like, game journos came out and tried fabricating this narrative that the controls didn't work. And then like years later, they did the same thing with Star Fox Zero, which people still like repeat incessantly. Like, again, it needs to stop. Okay, like, again, people are talking about Super Mario Bros. And Tears of the Kingdom, right? People are talking about all these Nintendo games, but all they do is just constantly just whine and cry about everything, to the point where actual enthusiasts like myself can't even really take them seriously as valid complaints. Because when you really think about it critically, like, what actual complaint do people have with Tears of the Kingdom and Super Mario Bros. Wonder? How are these games significantly lesser than what came before them? You can see by playing Tears of the Kingdom how much different it is from playing Breath of the Wild, right? You can see all the new mechanics, all the great new dungeons, the change in direction, how characters have changed and evolved over time. Like, if you loved Breath of the Wild, you should love Tears of the Kingdom. And yet there's this compulsive, obsessive need to try and like pretend as if that isn't true. Like, oh, we wanted older Zelda games. We wanted more traditional Zeldas, and we're never gonna get it. And then Nintendo releases Echoes of Wisdom, which people tried to go after, but because they spent so much time like railing on Tears of the Kingdom, it was kind of a lost cause for them. But like, again, they still tried to go after Echoes of Wisdom, right? Like, they constantly do this thing where they just complain about everything, and it just boggles the mind. It's so out of touch with the actual state of the gaming industry. Because what other company has kept their IPs as fresh and relevant as Nintendo has? Pikmin debuted in 2001, right? People called it a failure of an IP. Everybody hated it. The GameCube was a joke. Like, Nintendo was supposed to go third party because Pikmin was such a failure, right? And yet when Pikmin 4 comes out, it becomes a huge success. Why? Because Nintendo stuck with the IP, they built up its audience, and they developed the franchise. I wouldn't even say Pikmin 4 is good, right? But because of all the good games they did make, right, with 1 through 3, like, Pikmin 4 was by far the most successful out of any of them. Like, again, what other company could have made that work? Like, again, nobody comes even close. Baldur's Gate 1 came out in like 98, right? Nobody talks about it. Nobody remembers it, right? Nobody plays that game at all. And now it looks like we're not even going to get a sequel to Baldur's Gate 3, right? Like, it's crazy when you compare like there's just the level of quality and care put into Nintendo games versus their competitors. And everybody just delusionally wants to pretend otherwise. People really try and prop up Astrobot as an example of like the peak of 3D platforming. Completely ignoring the fact that Mario is right there. Completely ignoring the fact that Astrobot is somehow like comes up short compared to like Donkey Kong 64 and Banjo-Kazooie, games that are almost 30 years old. You know, Never mind like the current state of game. Like we see this all the time, in which people prop up mediocrity in order to downplay the excellence of Nintendo and its games.